All right, so before we hop into it, I will give a quick rundown on the plan for today. So the Minister of Finance is going to be walking us through a couple of quick budget highlights. And after that, we're going to open it up to the question and answer portion. You'll notice on your screen there is a Q&A tab. At any time, if you have questions as we're going through the presentation, please feel free to write those in. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. And with that said, I will hand it over to the Minister to go through our budget highlights.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning. All right, so this is the second year in a row of doing budget dialogues, a little earlier this year, and an opportunity to pick up on some of the discussions from last year. There are some slides that are sort of built on where we got to last year and questions asked last year. Without ado, we can jump into the first slide. Great, so as Sean said, just a bit of information about how the budgets work. Good to do a little bit of reminding of how we organize the budget, because there are two budgets. There's the operating budget and the capital budget. The capital budget, not surprisingly, deals with capital expenditures, so infrastructure items, everything from roads and bridges, but also, of course, all the various buildings from health centers to schools, and the maintenance of all of those things, as well as the operating budget. This is all the day-to-day spending and functioning for programs and services across the GNWT. It also is the budget that reports on or estimate for all of our incoming revenues. The operating budget is dealt with in the March and February session, and the capital budget is done in the fall, because that gives a little bit more lead time to prepare for capital projects that would be starting up in the summer. Little rule at the bottom there comes from our fiscal responsibility policy, which is to say that we must have capital or have an operating surplus in order to do a capital investment in the capital budget. So we have to run a surplus operating budget, in other words, to be able to have money to invest in capital expenses. 50% of the capital budget needs to come from those surpluses. Right. Thank you. Government budgeting general rule: don't spend more than you have. That probably seems self-evident, but governments can and certainly do run deficits. And part of what guides how we do that is within what's called our fiscal strategy. So that's looking at the totality of the government's budget, government's fiscal situation, economic situation, and coming up with a fiscal strategy that guides how and where we spend the money, how we do take on debt, and what kind of debt we would be taking on. But of course, overall, if not unlike someone's household, if the spending is more than the revenues, well, then that leads to borrowing. And at some point, if that can become unsustainable. If we're taking in, spending less than we take in, then you have a surplus. And as I said, for us, it's important to run a surplus because of the fiscal responsibility policy and the need to use that money to invest in infrastructure. Okay. Thank you. All right, so here is where we are at year over year from last year. So the green line is where we were at way back in pre-COVID times, but just at the release of Budget 2020. This was before COVID-19 was really on anyone's radar significantly. And at that time, we were predicting a significant surplus for 2021 and some surpluses for the next couple of years, which would have given a bit of time to hopefully get the 19th Assembly moving forward on some of its initiatives, and really addressing the fact that we already had some economic challenges and some fiscal challenges, and we knew that. Unfortunately, of course, we have been dealing with a pandemic for the last year and a half, and you can see the blue line, Budget 2021, the impacts of on what the projections were for the surplus was certainly, the projection was pretty far off, and the surplus became a deficit. And the projections over the next few years are also much lower for the next couple of years, and then continuing to arc down into the next few years. So as a result of which, the situation that we already knew was going to be challenging, we now don't even have as much wiggle room as we had hoped to have as a result of not only our response to COVID-19, but the impacts on the economy as a whole. One note is that something that does give us a bit of a cushion is the territorial formula financing grant. This makes up 70% of the revenues of the government of Northwest Territories. It's a grant from the federal government, and it accounts for the fact that as a territory, small in population and fairly remote, we do not have the same ability to raise revenues as a large province does. That's true for the 3 territories. All 3 are subject to territorial formula financing. And that gives us also a bit of a cushion where when there's been a shock to revenues, such as a result of COVID-19, over the course of a 3-year running average, there will be mitigation of the impacts of the loss of, will be a mitigation of the impacts of those revenue losses. So definitely is a benefit to us to have that territorial formula financing on years like the last one. Now, interestingly, so in the operating budget, which is where we are again talking about running those surplus budgets, in the operating budget, we do include all federal capital transfers. So not only is there territorial formula financing, but another major part of the revenues that are reflected in that operating budget are all of the money that comes in for capital from the federal government, which for us is often at a 75% rate. So 75-25 is the split that we get on many of our capital plans, which is certainly a significantly better deal than what is often dealt to the provinces, again, considering the location, the remoteness, and the ability to raise own source revenues. But when you take that out, when you take out that capital amount, we actually find that, so we are already running a deficit. There are no surpluses. So the surplus itself is a species in part of the fact that we're getting federal money to spend on capital. So if you take that out, it's another way of showing that we really are in a situation where we are actually spending more than what we have on our operations, and this slide to me is one that I think is actually quite telling, that shows that we do have an issue in terms of spending more than what we are taking in for those operations. Another way of showing sort of the same messaging, different visual. We've stacked here the operating expenditures, which is orange, along, and then over top on that is the gray capital expenditures. So that's that total spend there, split between operating and capital. And tracking over that in blue are the revenues that we take in. So on very rare occasions does the blue revenue line hit at or near the top of our total expenses. Typically, it's coming in a bit below that, and which means that anything below that, we're taking on debt to cover the costs. And as I said again, governments do tend to run some amounts of deficits. It's not uncommon, and it's actually, that's not in and of itself a problem, provided that it continues to be sustainable. But the concern here, of course, as I said from the last slide, is that our operations are starting to cost more. So it's not only a matter of capital investments, it's even just the functioning of the government. What's interesting here is we're looking all the way back to 2002. So the challenge of meeting up expenses and revenues and finding that balance between a sustainable amount of debt versus getting into a situation where operations themselves are running at a deficit, some of those challenges have been longstanding. And there's certainly years where, the revenues coming in within the capital expenses, so that the debt we're taking on tends to be purely for the debt or for the capital expenses. But there's certainly been other years, going back all the way to 2002, where we certainly have been challenged to achieve that goal of not spending more than what we're taking in. And one more way of showing it. So each one gives a bit of a different flavor. Here, there's an actual gap. You can see the gap between the cash coming in blue and the cash going out in orange. Tells a different, a little bit of a different story here in that, you can start to see a gradual reduction in the gap between the two as the projections go forward. But of course, that achieving those projections means all things remaining so as they are predicted, which tends to not be the way life goes. Sometimes we can do better, and sometimes things might come up that are unexpected, not the least of which could be a particularly bad fire season, which may well be the case this year. We'll see how things unfold. So, but again, just being able to see the way the gap kind of goes out and back again gives a visual representation of the kind of challenge we have. Obviously, the closer that is together, the more sustainable the budget and the budget projections are. The wider the gap, the more debt we're taking on, and then it gets into the realm of being unsustainable. And if it is unsustainable, your total debt keeps growing. So again, one of the other things that does make our situation significantly different from a province where is that we have a federally imposed borrowing limit. So it's not a question of us entirely managing our own house and managing our own debt and saying, well, look, the debt that we have is being fiscally managed. There are some measures that we use for that. For example, again, under that fiscal responsibility policy, from less than 5% of total revenues is permitted to go for debt servicing. And we're well under that right now. But we continue to run up against that debt limit. So, it's not meant to be a credit card that you max out. It's meant to be a tool to be managed in order to pay for capital and to make strategic investments. Again, it's not a credit card that you're allowed to max out a little bit. So, continuing to inch up towards that orange line is not the kind of sustainable debt management that we want to be taking on or want to be known for. On to the next. So sort of then what needs to happen? Next slide. What needs to happen? Well, in some ways it's a sort of obvious answers in some ways. You need to generate more cash from your operating surpluses in order to have less borrowing pressure and to have less total debt added on year over year. And of course, because if we don't, you may recall from the last slide, we do once again run up against the debt limit, and it is certainly not enviable to have to go back continually to the federal government and keep saying that we continue to max out that credit card. So the next couple slides have some questions around what it is that we can do. Again, the answer seems simple in some ways, I think, but the actual how of these things is where it gets more difficult and more complex, and is really part of the purpose of budget dialogues, is to have that kind of a conversation with residents and businesses. So there's a number of different options, of course. Reallocate money to fund new programs that might help stimulate whether it's recruitment and retention of new residents or opening of new businesses. Internally, of course, we do have a $2 billion budget funding quite a wide variety of programs and services. Can we make programs more efficient? Should we be evaluating their effectiveness, or how do we evaluate the effectiveness? And then once we have that information, what do we do? How do we in fact take that information and make our $2 billion work harder for us? And then the last bullet there, noting about strategic infrastructure investments. So, again, we already have an infrastructure deficit in the north. We have less quality infrastructure as compared to the provinces and even some of our neighboring territories. So it's not enough of an answer to simply say, well, don't spend on that. It's how and where you spend, with a view to, again, stimulating whether it's economic growth or population growth or all of the above. We are already trying to do many of these things. So budget dialogues is a chance to make sure residents and businesses, stakeholders, nonprofits are all aware of the challenges that we're facing as a government, see themselves reflected in that, in the response, and have their input and ideas reflected back in the way we're managing what is public money. 4-year business planning, this is year 2 that we're going into of having 4-year business plans. The goal to get departments looking a little more strategically at what they do, again, with that eye on efficiency, with that $2 billion budget. The procurement review, initial report from the panel has just come in, and our own working group here within the departments are going to look at that and review it, so that we can get that moving out this fall and hopefully see some positive changes so that procurement can be a tool that we use to stimulate growth. And government renewal is a significant initiative underway already for both EC&E and finance, to look at how we spend money and make sure we're being efficient and driving value and gathering the information to make choices about what is working and what might not be working. Questions to think about for residents and the public. Well, so what programs and services infrastructure benefit you, benefit your community? Really, it's what are the essential things that the government delivers that should either simply not be changed, enhanced? Where can we get the more bang for our buck? And conversely, what items are maybe less important? Which are the, are there things that the government is trying to do or doing that are not efficient, not essential, not achieving their best value? And whether that means cutting that and then taking the money to fund other operations, or whether it simply means refocusing it so that, again, if we're spending public dollars, we want to be actually achieving goals of growth, health, education, all those things. So questions, be happy to get feedback on. The next section 2 is focused on revenues, the revenue side of the budget. This is not a new challenge that there's a weak connection between the economy and GNWT revenue, simply because, again, we have a fairly small population and sort of a weak inability to have revenue coming into the government directly from the economy. Again, as I said, 70% of our total revenues are from territorial formula financing, but over 10% more come from various other federal transfers, the Canada Health Transfer, for instance. So, in fact, I think in the last budget, we were only at around 15% of the total revenues were actually own source revenues, or revenues generated within the territory by the GNWT. So a fairly small amount, a fairly small impact on the total revenues coming from things that we are able to directly control or impact, such as taxes. So that said, 15% is 15%. What can we do to increase tax revenue should we choose to use this tool? Two options, or two ways of looking at it. You have the tax base, meaning more people, more businesses paying taxes, which of course then increases the amount that the government receives, or an increase to taxes, meaning that the actual amount that each person pays goes up, so that, again, or each business pays, or some segment of the group's pay, which again increases what is available. And we'll go through both of those in the next few slides. So looking at the lens of, if there's economic growth, then you are hopefully increasing your tax base, meaning, in other words, that there are more people paying income taxes, there are more businesses paying income taxes, then, there may well be that would then result in there being simply more taxes therefore coming in. That important note, though, is that if in fact the economy is doing well, there's more jobs, people are coming up to the north, staying in the north, then that population growth certainly does contribute in a tax sense, but it also very significantly contributes to the territorial formula financing amount, because we get roughly $40,000 per person. So for every person that comes up to the north, stays in the north, that is a significant positive impact on what we're getting in that territorial formula financing grant, which again is the single most significant item in the revenue column. And there's always going to be some constraints, some limitation, that even with economic growth, as our economy may be growing, some of those jobs are going to continue to be occupied by individuals not resident of the Northwest Territory, whether it's because of our own small workforce, whether it's because of the need for certain specialized skills. Some of that is going to leak south. And similarly, some of the expenses that we may find that we have on spending for particular goods, services, specialized items, we're going to be buying them from the south. So there's always, even with economic growth, there's going to be some leakage of that amount. And the other side of taxes is, again, besides the tax base, would be the actual tax rates. So tobacco and liquor markups up here in the Northwest Territories are at or near the top of all of Canada. However, tax rates overall, outside of those two, do tend to be at or near the bottom. We do not have a territorial sales tax. So there certainly would be, there is an option, and it really is one that's really open for discussion, which is why we're having it here around, would there be a benefit to an increase in taxes? That said, I will want to note that personal income tax is only 5% of total revenues. So, even an increase here, although it certainly does make some difference, it's a pretty small difference. Even less so is the corporate income tax, which is about 1% of total revenues, similar to resource royalty revenues. So these are all pretty small parts of the overall revenue pie, particularly as compared to the amounts, as I said earlier, that we'd be getting under the territorial formula financing. And we're the benefit of having more people and the influence on that is much more significant. Nevertheless, looking for always good to explore all the options. And one of those options under increasing tax rates would certainly be to have a new top tax bracket. We right now have only 4 tax brackets. It's a progressive system. So just like the rest of Canada, businesses that have more are generally expected to pay more based on their ability to pay. We have only the 4 brackets right now, as I said. Most jurisdictions have gone to 5, adding a 5th one to the top. So we've looked and run some numbers on having a 5th bracket of taxable income of over $200,000. But our estimate is that there'd be about 425 people to whom this would apply, or 425 taxpayers to whom this would apply. If we put it at 16% for that portion of income, over $200,000 would raise around $1 million. And if we put it at 20% on the amount above 200,000, well, then that would raise about $3 million per year. And another option, another discussion point is the idea of a sales tax. So the sales tax idea is one, again, there are other provinces and territories that do not have a sales tax. A lot do. And if we were to do this, it would be done with CRA. They'd be the ones administering it for us. The numbers we've run suggest that at 2%, the sales tax would raise approximately $20 million per year. So a fairly significant sum. However, on the other side is that same increase, that 2% increase, would likely raise overall cost of goods and therefore impact on cost of living by about 1.4%. There's the difference between the 2% and the 1%. The amount raised of the tax, the amount raised at cost of living is because we tried to back out items that would likely be exempt. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but it is strongly likely that any sales tax would want to have a number of exemptions so as to not be targeting items such as heating fuel, children's clothes, children's shoes, various other items with an effort to mitigate some of the impacts of the increase of tax. So again, it's a significant number, but also some significant impacts to cost of living to keep in mind. So for this section, questions to think about here, and again, these are just broadly the kinds of issues and things that one might want to consider. Should taxes be increased? Pure and simple. Again, remembering all the charts at the beginning and the growing gap between what we take in and what we spend. If we want to keep every single program exactly as it is, every service, and have all the infrastructure, well then should taxes be used as a tool to help pay for that? Or do we again look more at the expenses side of what is being spent and try to reduce that in order to avoid any additional taxes or impacts to the rate of taxes? And with that, on to the last section. This is sections generally about the economy more broadly spoken, framed certainly at the opening end largely around the labor force. So for a long time, not a new thing, our economy has more employment than what the resident labor force is able to supply. Numbers are not too different from last year, but we have about 23,000 people of an age to be members of the resident labor force, and around 21,000 of them are in fact employed. However, our total employment is over 26,000. So we have a fairly significant difference, and that difference is filled by non-resident laborers. They then do not pay income tax in the Northwest Territories, so we lose that opportunity to take that in as revenue. They do pay a payroll tax. There is payroll tax here, but that is not nearly the same amount or level of income as what one would get from direct income taxes. So on the other hand, as I mentioned, I think earlier talking about economic growth, we still remain an overall small population period, and therefore it's likely that there's going to continue to be some need to bring non-resident workers up, whether it's for specialized skills or simply to fill the fact that there's just not enough people in the north at various times or in certain places to fill the needs that we have for the economic growth that we would like to see. Not new, again, is the fact that the Northwest Territories economy continues to be dominated by the public sector and by the mineral resources sector. Far and away the two largest sectors of the economy, two largest contributors to the GDP. Also the two highest paying sectors in the Northwest Territories. And, good news being that they are also both quite strongly linked to other sectors. So, it's easy to see some of the linkages when you think of the service sector being connected to public administration. You see construction sector linked to mineral resources, but many other sectors as well are impacted by both of these two. So keeping that in mind, what the government does and how we do it, such as through procurement, can have a significant impact, which, however, that leads to the next two slides, which are about what we can and cannot control. This one is, I think, much the same as what we presented last year, which at the top, mineral resource dominated economy. Well, we do not have the ability as GNWT to influence global demand for non-renewable resources in general, let alone for diamonds, which continues to be the dominant feature of our mineral resources sector. So whether that's financial markets, whether it's actual just global demand for commodities, those are things to which we really are somewhat at the mercy of what may be happening on a much larger geopolitical scale. Also, at this point, not a lot of ability to change what's happening with international tourism. We certainly do have the ability to influence marketing, and have done pretty incredible work with GNWT Tourism as the entity that does a lot of our marketing, and to support the tourism sector. But at the end of the day, if there are border controls and restrictions in other countries or at our own international borders, that is not something over which we have any ability to influence. And lastly is population. There's certainly been over more than one assembly targets and efforts and strategies to increase the population. As I said earlier, that the impact of having one more person on territorial formula financing is significant. But despite all of those efforts, population remains fairly stable. So we've put this in the cannot control category. But what we can control. And some of the things we can control, it's not necessarily a direct connection between, say, public utilities and a revenue stream. But by controlling these things and by influence these things, we're creating, hopefully, an environment and an atmosphere within which businesses can flourish. And therefore, more businesses, more successful businesses, more income on those businesses, as well as creating a place that people want to move and want to stay. Which then again brings that's where we don't have direct control over the population, but we certainly do have some control over the things that make people want to live somewhere, and also and to want to stay. So infrastructure, and program services, public utilities, regulation, taxation, all of those things influence business choices and people's choices on where they are living and what they are doing there. So now the last slide here is some of the big picture questions of the kinds of things we are very happy to hear feedback and comments on. What do we want the economy to look like? So again, keeping in mind that there are things we can and cannot influence, at the same time as we make choices about the kinds of programs we have, the kind of services we have, where we focus efforts and attention and public dollars, that can start to influence where we see economic growth, and development and innovation, which then in turn leads to the next bullet of what kind of jobs we want to have, what kind of industries we want to be supportive of or trying to incubate. And keeping in mind the huge role of the private sector, of the non-government sector, private sector, including nonprofits, they have a real opportunity to support in terms just of going out and speaking about what is in the North, as well as generating their own innovation opportunities. And then the last bullet, kind of completing that loop, is what can government be then doing to support those entities that are out there, and whether it's again through what kind of environment, what kind of atmosphere do we want to be creating with those things that we can control, from infrastructure through to a regulatory environment, through to various programs and services. So that is it for this year's budget dialogues. There's a lot more information on the website, a lot more information available there, opportunities to do filling out of forms and sending in of information. There's, I would say there's no end of ways to submit some ideas and thoughts, whether it's directly by email to one of the folks online here, or through the website. I know last year I read the entire hundreds and hundreds of pages information we got from people. And some was comments, some was observations, and some was definitely some good ideas about directions that we might take. So Sean, I'll pause there. I think there's a bit of a lag, but hopefully everyone's caught up and would be able to post questions if there are any, or be able to find where they can go to add their feedback.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that. We do have a few questions in the queue, and I'm going to publish them one at a time here. Is that first one showing up on your screen, Minister?
Not quite yet.
All right, I will read it out for the
Sure.
For the sake of simplicity. I saw that the government issued bonds in 2020. Does the GNWT have plans to sell more bonds in the future?
I mean, I wouldn't say that there's plans insofar that was a strategic choice that was made then, knowing that that was not a financial tool that we had used in the past. It got us, you know, I don't remember the numbers in front of me right now, but I remember we did do an analysis of what that would do to improve our servicing over debt, and it was a significant improvement on the debt servicing costs that we have. So I would, you know, generally say that yes, given that we, you know, saw that marked improvement over what we would spend and the impacts of having debt from using a bond tool, that is probably a tool that we will want to use in the future. As for a specific plan, no, I mean, I don't think we have. It's not. I can't say it's happening next month or in 6 months from now. There's not a plan in that sense, other than to say that it's a tool that is commonly used by governments for good reason, and we're happy to have finally started to get into that realm to be able to use that tool as well.
Perfect, thank you. And just as a reminder to those on the call, if you do have other questions, please feel free to put those into the chat and we'll bring those forward. And we have a couple more that we're going to be bringing forward now.
All right, I think I have two showing up in my screen now, but why don't you go ahead and read just so we all stay on the same path.
Sounds good. So our next question, it seems that growing government spending is mostly to blame for our increasing debt, and one thing that we can control to a large extent. Is there a serious plan to cut government spending?
Yeah, so I mean, well, that's a long question. That is really the beginning of the slides where I mean, the point of showing that expansive growth, the point of showing that we are spending more on our operations and what we are taking in when you back out the contributions of the federal government to capital, that whole point is to make it clear to people that we right now deliver more programs, more services, and more things within the government than what we have the revenue to sustain. That is exactly the point. So I say all that to say that I'm certainly well aware of it, and the Department of Finance is certainly well aware of it, and we are trying to make sure that everyone else is certainly well aware of it. What we do about it becomes obviously the more complicated question. You may recall the last assembly did a sort of, I think 20% off the top period cut, and yet here we are. So, you know, it was our effort and our desire to be much more methodical. And you hear people talk about evidence-based decision making, and that sounds great. But how do you actually do that? Well, you need to have the evidence. You need to know what's working and what's not. The last thing you want to do is go and cut a program that people depend upon for health, wellness, education, because that's the future of the territory. Or that business sector says, look, this is the one thing you guys are doing that's helping us innovate and helping us grow. So the point of government renewal, the government renewal initiative, is to go out, do a true inventory of all the things we do with those $2 billion, department by department, figure out what is in fact working and what is not. Some of it is obvious, right? There's that sense of how do you not know? Some of it is obvious for sure, but with $2 billion across all departments and across 33 communities, there's an awful lot of programs and services. So it takes a little bit longer than what one might like, but at the end of the day, it's certainly our expectation that we're going to have proper data, evidence, and information to be able to make those decisions, so that if something needs to get cut or if money needs to get moved, we're doing that based on facts.
Thank you. And I've just published an additional question. Have you considered that this top tier income tax bracket might only work to further encourage people who work at the mine to work and live in other jurisdictions? Would also possibly negatively affect those considering remote work and living in the territory, and those who lump sum their pensions. Considering the anticipated revenue it would generate, this new proposal seems to be a purely symbolic and bike shed issue.
Yeah. So I certainly would say that we are considering the well, let's just say it, the potential downsides or negative impacts of a top tier income bracket. I mean, as I said, there's estimated to be only about 425 people to whom this would apply. So, because again, keeping in mind it's amount of income, it's your taxable income over $200,000 that's impacted. So it's not everyone who makes over $200,000 would be impacted. It's actually very much smaller than that. It's people who have taxable income, even that's even after all the other taxes are paid, that they still have more taxable income over that. So it's a pretty small cohort of folks. But yeah, do we create a tax bracket that impacts 425 people? And who are those 425 people? What contributions are they making? And what would this tax rate do to influence their choices? And there's, so, simple answer is yes, we're considering that. And, it is a challenge where you certainly don't want those who have the ability to pay more to not be in a progressive fair system paying more. We also are conscious it's a small jurisdiction with a small population, and as I was saying elsewhere in the presentation, it's so important. The single biggest thing of importance here is to bring more people up and not to lose people. So all of those things are things to be considered.
All right, and I'm breaking from our order a little bit. This would seem like a good follow-up from a previous response. So when can we expect government renewal initiative to be completed? And when can we expect to see changes as a result of this exercise? Time doesn't appear to be on our side.
Yeah, no, time doesn't appear to be on our side, unfortunately. And the one slide that you saw there showing some of the history back to 2002. And there's, lots of other slides that show similar stories, that the economic challenges that we have broadly in the Northwest Territories, as well as the fiscal challenges of the GNWT, aren't new. They've been around for a while. And I don't want it to sound like I'm suggesting that past governments haven't made efforts. I think, as I just said, the last assembly did just a blanket cut. So, there's been efforts made. They just haven't necessarily done much, or certainly not achieved the kind of stability and spending reduction or revenue growth that we need to see. So we're expecting the first two departments that are going through the entirety of the process are finance and EC&E. I don't have we have a full chart of the timelines of the different stages of government renewal, of doing an inventory and doing the analysis and then doing some recommendations department by department. We do have that mapped out. As I said, I don't have it in front of me right now. I believe the first two are expected this fall. And the goal was to be able to see changes in the next budget. I don't know if we'll meet that challenge necessarily, but the vision at one point, I think probably a bit pre-COVID, was to start to see those changes in budgets of this assembly, not in 5 years from now, but in the budgets of this assembly, to see the changes that are going to result from government renewal. We won't get through every single department in their entirety in this assembly. That's not realistic. We are also, I will say, looking at whether we can target. There's certainly certain program areas that as a government we know are more challenged than others, and so those ones might get put ahead of their departments to actually sort of look at whether or not things are going well. So yeah, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that time does take time, but I still very much believe that to do actual evidence-based decision making, you need evidence. So. Okay.
All right, we have a new one in the stack. The GNWT's attempts to stimulate economic growth in the territory over the past 10 years have proved to be less than effective. Should we
utterly futile? Just say it. That's what it
I'll
says.
Just say it. Should we be optimistic that this will change drastically over the next 10 years? Why or why not? If not, where does that leave us?
Oh man, I am perennially optimistic. So maybe that's a personality flaw, maybe not. I think we should be optimistic. So let me start with that. Yeah, there's definitely been and I can appreciate why Sean doesn't want to say that things have been utterly futile. I think it's a matter of perspective. As we said, I think part of that one slide or the two slides that show what we can affect and what we can't affect is important to keep in mind. We want to make sure that when the government is doing the things of government, that we are actually influencing the things we can influence and not trying to influence things that we cannot, because that's not a good use of government resources. So, can we necessarily, create a new economy? I mean, I'll use the knowledge economy initiative because that's just gone out for some engagement, some dialogue and discussion with the public as an ITI initiative. Can the government create a knowledge economy? Probably not. Can the government help support businesses, industries, and individuals and nonprofit organizations who themselves might be in a position to create the hubs, to create the webs, to create the linkages that can be a growth place for what is known as a knowledge economy? Well, yes. So I think it's a question of being thoughtful and strategic about the things we can do and the things we can't do. We can't go and open up a new mine. The government can't go out and discover a new resource, but the government can say, look, we're going to look at critical minerals now. We're going to make sure that there's access to the information of the NTGS, of the Geological Society, the Geological Survey, about this information, about critical minerals, promote the fact that there's a lot of critical minerals in the north, and ask what infrastructure might be necessary to help support. I mean, you can't fly out some of these things the way you do diamonds. So do we need to look at our infrastructure? So there are things that we can't do, but there are things that we can. So I am optimistic that with some thoughtfulness about what we can do and what we can't, as well as some thoughtfulness around where we can spend the dollars that we have, that we certainly can. Now, if things are dire, and where does that leave us? One thing that I've had long-term Northerners say to me is that somehow or other things always do seem to roll along. I was speaking actually just yesterday to Hay River, and they were saying, when they lost Pine Point Mine, people thought the community would just turn into a ghost town, and it hasn't, and Hay River is actually flourishing. So I don't necessarily know all the answers as to why, but I think that's a good lesson to take and a good reminder to have, that things can have a way of working themselves out. I don't see any more in the queue.
No, our queue is empty at the moment, so I will do a last call for any questions. And if there are no new questions into the queue in the next couple of minutes, we will move on to some quick closing comments and thank everyone for their time.
Sure.
And right on cue, one moment, please. All right, so we have a new question into the queue. The NWT seems to be in a worse economic position than our neighbors to the east and west. What is unique about our situation here, and what can we do to reverse this trend? Do you think that consensus government affects our ability to move forward and spark growth?
All these compound questions. So fortunately, I have it in front of me. Let me go one at a time. What is unique about our situation? So sorry, actually, the comment first of being in a worse economic position. I mean, I think there's been some recent Conference Board of Canada, if not other sources, that have suggested that our growth has been behind. I know the mineral resource sector is facing a lower level of exploration spend than what the other two territories had in the last recent while. Our exploration spend does seem to be on the uptick right now, though, I will say. And some of the projects that we do have, early stage projects, are doing very well and raising some good capital to move themselves forward. So, the overall trends might still have us showing low, but the actual on the ground realities is that there are actually some positive signs in terms of the mineral resource sector itself, which is still a huge part of GDP. Other areas, frankly, have weathered COVID better than what a lot of other areas in other provinces have. I mean, certainly our jobs have returned faster than in other provinces. So, yeah, big picture numbers might not yet be trending well, but I do think there's some positive signs. What's unique and what can we do to reverse it? Certainly the North as a whole is unique, but then as we've all observed, if the other territories aren't facing the same challenges, we need to look at our own situation. One of the things that And actually, this came out from some of the other dialogues recently in the last week. Some of the groups that we've spoken to in the dialogues. One thing that's different here is the outstanding land claims and self-governance negotiations that are underway. The Yukon and Nunavut. I mean, Nunavut has really one land claim entity, and so it's a very different situation in terms of land claims, land accessibility, and Indigenous government relationships there. The Yukon too, I would venture to say, is a lot less complex, and again, comparably settled as compared to what's happening in the Northwest Territories, where we have a lot of outstanding claims still, and that makes it difficult to have, well, land access or land certainty, land use planning, understanding who will be responsible for choices about access to land and uses of land. That has, I think, actually a pretty huge influence. So, what can be done to reverse that? Well, obviously, moving forward on land claims, but that also involves the federal government and it involves Indigenous governments. So I know there's a real push within this government. It's one of the priorities to move that forward. And hopefully we do see that start to happen. I think that would be the single biggest thing that probably would make a difference in the next few years. And do I think consensus government affects the ability to move forward and spark growth? No, I don't. I have learned more about consensus government in the last not quite 2 years than what I did looking from the outside in. It has its challenges. Not having political parties means you don't have a party platform. You don't walk in and say, this is now the platform in the direction of the government. It's much more complicated. We have 19 members who all come in, who set all the different priorities. Then you have a cabinet who's, again, not part of a platform. All 7 of us are comparable independents who have to kind of move together forward as a team. But at the same time, that allows us to truly reflect all the different regions. It allows perspectives and ideas to come in a little more organically, I think. And for a wide territory with so many different cultures and languages to be reflected, I think consensus government's a strength. And it can make us unique and distinct in Canada. So I think it's a strength. I think it's an asset. I'm not trying to commodify having a consensus government system, but I think it's one that actually could spark growth. Eric.
And with that, our question queue is again empty. So thank you for taking the time to answer all of these questions and to walk us through the budget highlights, Minister. And I'm conscious that we're rapidly approaching 12 o'clock.
That's perfect timing.
It is perfect timing. Any closing comments or remarks from your side before we let everybody enjoy their afternoon?
No, only just my appreciation for folks who tune in and who ask questions. It is, whether it's feedback that we get, but also the kind of questions people ask, I think gives a good sense to myself and everyone who I know are taking notes, to have a sense of what the thinking is in the public, within residents, with businesses, and make sure that the budget that we have, that is public dollars, is reflecting all of those priorities and perspectives. So my appreciation for everyone's time.
Thank you again. And if any questions come to our participants after this call ends, please feel free to send those in via the question form that's on the Government or Department of Finance website. As the Minister mentioned earlier, we do take a peek through all of those. So I encourage you to submit any additional questions, thoughts, comments through that channel. And thank you to everybody. Have an excellent afternoon.